Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, Central Florida's Auto Racing Legacy. I'm Katie Kelly. I'm the Special Programs Coordinator here at the Orange County Regional History Center. I'll share a little bit of information about our organization for anyone who may be attending a Lunch and Learn for the first time. The History Center is located in downtown Orlando, and we offer 3 floors of permanent exhibitions, renowned special exhibitions from the Smithsonian, a variety of interactive, unique experiences, and programs for guests of all ages. While the History Center is partially funded by Orange County, donations to the Historical Society of Central Florida are vitally important to the center's ability to serve the community and continue to fulfill our mission to serve as the gateway for community engagement, education, and inspiration by preserving and sharing Central Florida's continually unfolding story. Donations allow for the care and upkeep of the historic collection, presentation of special exhibitions, and offering innovative programs. I'm going to put a few links in the chat for anyone who's interested in supporting the museum and the Historical Society. There are a variety of ways you can do that through donations, volunteering, just attending our events like you're doing today. All are great ways to support us. So I have dropped those links in the chat. Today's program is being facilitated as a webinar. So that means that our attendees do not have access to your video and audio. We will save some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to put any questions you have for us in the chat as they come up, and we'll address those at the end. Allie and I will do our best, and if we don't know the answer, we'll try and point you to some resources where maybe you can find those. So without any further ado, I think we can go ahead and jump right into today's program. So I will actually be facilitating today's program in conjunction with my colleague, Allie Olinchek. I'm the Special Programs Coordinator here at the History Center, and Allie is our Curriculum Coordinator. And so this past couple months, she and I have dived into the early history of Central Florida's racing legacy. So that's what today's webinar is going to cover. So we are not getting into the, well over 100 years of NASCAR, or not of NASCAR, of racing in Central Florida. What we're looking at today will be specifically the early years from 1903 up until NASCAR is established in 1948. And we're looking specifically at the racing that was occurring in the Ormond-Daytona Beach area. So racing was occurring in other spots, other places in Florida, but today's program is going to be looking at what was happening in Ormond-Daytona Beach. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, are we seeing that, Allie? Perfect. Okay, so today's program is going to look at some of the developments that occurred that sort of led through up to the establishment of NASCAR. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time looking at specific races or specific drivers, specific cars. It's going to be more about the narrative of racing in Central Florida, of that history, and how things developed and changed over time. With that being said, we may encounter some familiar names in discussing the early years of racing in Florida, and that is because some of the auto industry's most notable pioneers were active in Florida's early racing scene. Racing's origins start early on in the Progressive era, and we define the Progressive era as about 1896 to 1916, roughly. The invention of the automobile is one of the hallmarks of the Progressive era, and an interest in automobile racing encapsulates the spirit of that era. So the invention of the automobile can be seen as a centuries-long development that could date back as far as Leonardo da Vinci's designs for transport vehicles. Opinions actually vary regarding who should be credited with the invention of the automobile, and our knowledge and understanding of that continues to evolve regarding who should be credited with that achievement. Oftentimes you'll see Carl Benz credited. He is the person who has actually invented the first gasoline-powered automobile. So the automobiles that sort of led down the way to the invention of the internal combustion engine, which is what most of the vehicles, although of course not all of the vehicles that are on our streets today are. So Carl Benz typically gets credit for it, but there are certainly versions of automobiles and other automatically propelled vehicles well before that. So as far back as more than a century before Carl Carl Benz invented his first gasoline-powered automobile in 1885. We see steam-powered automobiles dating back to the mid 18th century, and then in 1832 to 1839 is when Robert Anderson is credited with inventing the first electric carriage. So opinions vary on that, and the opinions of historians are continually being revised as to who deserves the credit. But we're going to kind of go with Carl Benz because he invented his gasoline-powered three-wheeler, which is what we actually see on the screen here, is really going to sort of kick off the beginning of the racing era in the progressive period. So all three types of these automobiles are present in the early racing scene, both in Europe and in America, in the 20th century, at the turn of the 20th century, I should say. So we do see steam-powered, electric-powered, and gasoline-powered automobiles all represented. Understanding the spirit of the progressive era does actually help us to understand why racing took off and the early nature of racing. So the progressive era was sort of earmarked or hallmarked by this feeling, this philosophy that human condition could be improved, and that the way to achieve this was through science and through the work and the efforts of experts, people who had a lot of knowledge, applying that knowledge in ways to benefit humanity. This is really evident in the flurry of inventions of the progressive era, which include not only automobiles, but also airplanes, the telephone, radio, and many more. This was an era when there were a lot of new innovations, and that sort of innovative spirit encapsulates this era. These new innovations and these new inventions tend to have something in common, and that is that they bring people together in various ways, whether that be physically or intellectually. So, of course, automobiles, airplanes can bring people together physically, and it expands the horizons of the access that people have to the world around them. But also radio and telephone and films do that intellectually. They expand people's view of the world. They expand the ability to communicate. And so those are all hallmarks of the progressive era. So with this spirit of heralding technological advancement and innovation as a way to improve the human condition, it's only natural that those who were pioneering in the automobile industry had an interest in showing that their automobile was the fastest, therefore it was the most innovative, it was the most impressive. So the early era of racing is really influenced by this. People were really focused on of beating land speed records and holding the world record and the American record for having the fastest vehicle in a particular race category. So that really is emblematic of this era of racing. So automobile racing began really in the early years of the progressive era. Very few individuals owned automobiles at that time because they were brand new and they were expensive. And so automobiles at this time were actually seen more as an expensive and quirky hobby of the wealthy, rather than an innovation that served any practical purpose. In fact, for those who were going about the practical business of their daily life, they kind of saw automobiles as a nuisance. They were loud, they were dirty, they kicked up clouds of dust everywhere. If they were on unpaved roads, which most of the roads in America were unpaved at that time, they startled the horses, and the horses were much more common than automobiles on the road at this time. And horses were what most people were using to go about the practical aspects of living their daily lives. So it is interesting to note that really automobiles were seen initially not as an absolute like practical essential of life the way they are now, they were sort of seen as this like quirky, like, well, that's just something that that these rich people are fascinated by. International auto racing began in Europe in 1895. The first true race was held from Paris to Bordeaux in France and back, a distance of 1,178 kilometers. The winner made an average speed of 24.15 kilometers per hour, which is approximately about 15 miles per hour. So not the high impact speed race we think of today. And it's remarkable when we go through the early racing history, just how quickly cars advance and develop, and the speeds that they were achieving really only a decade and a half later. Organized automobile racing began in the United States with an 87-kilometer race from Chicago to Evanston, Illinois. This picture is not of that race, by the way, I want to be clear, on Thanksgiving Day in 1895. But by the time racing began in Florida, all of the major racing tournaments were still held in Europe. Europe was, of course, more developed than America, and therefore they had better quality roads to race on. European automobiles were superior, and at the time that racing starts in Florida, all of the significant records were held by Europeans. The American racing scene, as it existed at the time, didn't really stand a chance of competing against the early European racing scene. So Americans who were interested in racing weren't really initially as big of contenders for holding world records and things. And there are a variety of reasons for that. So partly it's that racing on the streets was difficult in America. It was not only logistically difficult, it was also a safety hazard. So streets were not smooth. Asphalt paving did not come about until years later. So the roads that they had to race on were either dirt roads or, kind of rough brick or cobblestone roads, which were not ideal. You can see the wheels on these cars are not exactly the robust tires that we have today. And there was also concern with safety for a variety of reasons. So particularly racing on city streets, safety was a grave concern at the time that racing started in Ormond-Daytona Beach in 1903, because in May of 1902, an electric car called the Baker Torpedo, attempting to set a 1-mile record in Staten Island, lost control and hit a street trolley. And it ended up bouncing. After it hit the street trolley, it ended up bouncing and it skidded into a crowd of spectators, killing 2 people and injuring 9 others. So safety was a major concern at the time that racing comes about in Florida, and that's going to be part of the reason, part of the impact why Daytona Beach, Ormond Daytona Beach, I should say, is considered really desirable. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Racing on rural roads and dirt roads was not much better. And most of the roads in America were these dirt rural roads. And so that's where some of the racing did take place. Early automobiles, their tires, as you can see, as I mentioned, they're not very robust. They're kind of narrow. If it was wet, the tires would get mired in the mud. And if it was dry, the tires kicked up huge dust clouds, excuse me. And that impeded visibility. So cars following behind these huge dust clouds wouldn't be able to see where turns were coming, and they would end up in ditches. It's also made it unpleasant to watch. You couldn't be really close to the race because of all the dust clouds. You had to be farther back. They did do some racing on horse tracks, and this is not a perfect solution because horse tracks also are dirt. And so it didn't solve the problem of the dust clouds. And then horse tracks at the time really didn't have substantial barriers between the track and the crowd. So while a fence may may work fine to keep an out of control horse on course or in but it would not be fine to keep an out of control automobile on course. An automobile, of course, would just plow through the fence that separated the audience from the race. So we'll talk in a bit about how Florida will solve some of those issues and why it would be seen as desirable. The reason that Florida first came on the radar for racing enthusiasts was because those who owned vehicles, the wealthy people from up north, those who owned vehicles were already in Florida in the winter because of Florida's tourism. It was a much desired area for some of Florida, for some of America's wealthiest businessmen, business people, I should say, and their families. And they would come to Florida's East Coast to spend the winter to escape from the brutal winters up north, where many of them lived the rest of the year. So they were already here. And many times they would bring their cars with them. And so the first person who was credited with, and I should say they would have their cars shipped down because at this point in time, it wasn't practical to drive a car from up north all the way down to Florida. So they would have their cars shipped down with them because they were enthusiastic about their automobiles and they wanted to have their sort of hobby with them while they wintered down here. Because it was warm enough down here for them to enjoy it. As you can see on the picture on the screen, there are the cars of the time were not what we have today, not even really as substantial as they would become in a few decades. So they were not practical to drive in cold weather. So they would bring them down here so they could enjoy them through the winter months. They would have them shipped down. The first person who is credited with being credited with driving on Ormond-Daytona Beach is a man named C.W. Siemens. He was one of the site's wealthy tourists. He brought his automobile south with him in 1900, and his first known incidents of driving and this is the first known incidents of driving on the beach on Ormond-Daytona Beach. Then in 1902, another winter tourist named C.W. Birchwood actually wrote an article that was published in Automobile Magazine titled "Why Not to Florida?" So he highlighted Florida in this article as an ideal destination for automobile leisure touring, and he particularly pointed out Ormond-Daytona Beach as an ideal site for this. He also indicated in his article that he thought the beach had potential for racing and setting world speed records. It's certainly possible that this national article helped to draw more automobile enthusiasts to Florida. So why was Ormond-Daytona Beach considered desirable? What was it about this particular beach that solved some of the problems with racing in other parts of America? The journey to Florida and shipping cars to Florida were expensive. There were very few roads in Florida at the time, at the turn of the century. So in order for this to have become the important venue for racing that it became in this era, there must have been something very desirable about this particular beach, and there was. So partly it was the weather. As I mentioned, the tourists were already down here because it was warm, and auto racing enthusiasts wanted to have somewhere where they could race in the winter. It was possible to race in the winter months here when most other areas of the country were not accessible. Not to mention the fact that the East Coast already had luxury hotels. So those who owned cars, who owned automobiles, it would have appealed to them to come somewhere where they're already going to be experiencing the luxury that they're used to because the East Coast was already established as a tourist destination with those luxury hotels. Additionally, the makeup of the beach was ideal for a couple of reasons. So the beach's surface is very smooth and very solid and hard on Ormond-Daytona Beach. And that is actually not very common for most beaches. Um, Asphalt and other smooth paving methods did not really begin until 1906. And so, of course, even after then, it would take many, many years before there were enough roads that even had that were even paved with asphalt for it to make much of an impact. Hard, smooth racing surfaces were hard to come by. At the time of the first tournament in 1903, there really wasn't acceptable smooth surfaces available in America the way there may have been in Europe. Um, the necessity for a smooth, flat surface on which to set speed records was amply apparent at the time. In fact, in January of 1904, having never seen the beach at Ormond-Daytona Beach, Henry Ford decided to set the 1 mile land speed record for his new Model B on the frozen Lake St. Clair in Michigan. It was perhaps the most dangerous 39 seconds of his life as he hit fissures in the ice. The vehicle became airborne several times, and then it was skidding side to side on the ice the rest of the time. Um, Ford was successful in setting the record. However, it was his experience certainly wasn't going to encourage many others to take up that endeavor of racing on frozen lakes and ice because it was apparent from his setting of that record that what he was doing was incredibly dangerous. And he did not hold that record for very long because it was just a few weeks prior to the second annual Ormond-Daytona Beach Tournament. A few months that would happen a few months later, and his record would be broken at that 1904 tournament. Ormond-Daytona Beach is unique in its smooth surface. There are only a handful, and you think of the miles and miles and miles and miles of coastline that exist in the entire world. There are actually only, someone did a survey, and there are only about 130 some that would be practical for driving a car on. So that's not very many throughout the whole world. And so to have a beach that was hard and smooth in an area where wealthy people were already flocking and in an area where they could race in the winter because it was warm was actually seen as it was kind of uniquely situated to become an important racing venue. And then additionally, the damp packed sand created a smooth surface to race on. So that helped keep the tires cool, and it helped to not kick up dust clouds as the racers raced. And then finally, the beach was seen as a much safer place to race. So on one side, you have water. So if a car goes out of control in that direction, it's just going to go into the water. On the other side, you have soft sand that will slow a vehicle down. And you have sand dunes that visitors and spectators can view from. So it was seen as a relatively safer way to race. Um, it was not without its perils, of course. A touring car had to go out every morning before a race and make sure that no debris had brushed up onto the shore, like driftwood or dead fish, large shells, anything like that. And because it was a tourist destination, it happened on occasion that someone would wander out onto the track. They would just be going for a nice stroll along the beach, and all of a sudden they're in the presence of a number of loud, dirty automobiles racing around them. So it was not completely without its perils, but compared to some of the other issues that existed at the time, it was more advantageous. So after C.W. Birchwood's article, we have another important person promoting the beach, and his name is J.F. Hathaway. He, like many other wealthy men of the day, was a northern businessman. He hailed from Massachusetts. He came south every winter. He stayed in Ormond Beach. And he was an avid automobile enthusiast who spent his winter months in Florida, where he found that the hard-packed surfaces of the beach were ideal for driving, and even informally racing his Stanley steamer. So this is him right here on the screen in his steam-powered vehicle. Hathaway proved to himself that the beach was a superior racing surface by timing himself on a staked-off 1-mile straightaway stretch on the beach, and then comparing that time to straightaway stretch in Rhode Island of the same length. So he timed himself in both locations, and his record on the beach was much better than his time on the straightaway road in Rhode Island. He was so enthusiastic about the possibilities for ORMOND-DAYTONA Beach to become a racing venue that he set out on a mission to promote the site, which is where this photograph originates from. He wrote an article which he sent to several newspapers and magazines around the country. Now, I pulled this photograph from the Florida Auto Annual in 1905. It was reproduced in the Florida Auto Annual. It originally was taken in 1903, or either late 1902 or early 1903, and was originally published with a promotional packet that Hathaway sent off to multiple newspapers and magazines throughout the country to try and promote Daytona Beach as a place for automobile enthusiasts to come. So we can see in this image that was published in January of 1903, just 1 month after Birchwood's article that was mentioned earlier, an array of the various means of wheeled propulsion available in the era, including the 3 main types, which are steam, gasoline, and electricity. I'm not sure exactly which one in these photos are electric, but I know this one is a steam-powered vehicle, and these are gasoline powered because they're the historic curved dashed Oldsmobiles, which were some of the first early popular touring cars amongst the wealthy. In addition to that, we see wind powered. So we have this sort of 3-wheeled sailor. We see man powered right here. We have a motorcycle, and we see horse-powered back here. A couple things to note. I think it's interesting and sort of telling of the spirit of the progressive era in this photograph that the horse-powered vehicle is sort of off in the distance. And to me, that sort of indicates that they're sending the message of this is in the past. This is, we've moved on from this. I also think that it's no accident that they included this bus type vehicle that has clearly several passengers. This really illustrates that the beach is suitable for all kinds of vehicles. This is probably much heavier than everything else sitting here on the beach, and it's not impacting in the sand at all. It shows that the beach is really solid and sturdy. All right. Having received some attention in newspapers and magazines and automobile publications throughout the country for ORMOND-DAYTONA Beach, the next person to step in is a man named William J. Senator Morgan. Senator was his nickname. He was an automobile correspondent for Automobile Magazine, which was the publication in which the C.W. Birchwood article had been published. He had experience as a publicist, and so the magazine, who was interested in finding a location for winter races, actually sent Morgan down to ORMOND-DAYTONA Beach to scope it out, to survey it and see if they thought that it would be a good location. And so this is the Ormond Hotel. And then in this photograph we have, this is actually Ransom Olds, and this is a curved dash Oldsmobile. So I said earlier that many of the pioneers of the automobile world were involved in the racing scene in Florida. Ransom Olds was one of them. This is J.F. Hathaway that I was just talking about a moment ago. And this is Morgan right here. And they're in front of some of the log guest house of the Ormond Hotel. So when he came and visited, Morgan agreed that the beach was a wonderful solution to many of America's racing logistical woes. He was helped along by the enthusiastic support of the proprietors of the Ormond Hotel. Of course, they would love to host a tournament that would bring lots of guests and wealthy people from all over the world, which it eventually would. So they saw the beach tournament, the idea of a beach tournament, to be greatly advantageous to them, and they enthusiastically supported it, providing lodging for anybody participating in the races and financial support as well. So thus the first tournament on Ormond-Daytona Beach was set for late March. So it happened very quickly. It was just a few months after he originally visited that the first tournament took place. The beach tournaments were held from 1903 to 1910, and Senator Morgan was the main promoter and organizer of the tournaments for all but 1 year. He was kind of pushed out 1 year with some drama that you can imagine typically might have happened around an event like this. But other than that, the years that it was most successful, he was the promoter of it. So the first tournament took place in 1903, and only 9 contestants raced. And of those 9 contestants, only 2 were actually race cars. So 3 were motorcyclists, 3 were wind-propelled sand sailors. I showed you an example of that earlier. I should say 3 were wind-propelled. 1 was the tricycle sand sailor, and 2 were bicycles with sails attached to them. And then 3 were automobiles, only 2 of which were actual racing cars. So while this may seem like an odd assortment, by today's standards, the first tournament was actually considered a great success, and it generated ample interest for future beach tournaments, and planning for subsequent tournaments actually began immediately concluding the first one. The types of vehicles that were seen at these tournaments were widely varied. So this is actually the Baker Torpedo Kid that I mentioned earlier that was racing on the street and slid into the spectators. This is an example of an electric car. This picture is from 1905, I believe. We also had gasoline-powered cars. I chose these 2 images because they really show that the vehicles that were being raced on the beach at this time were like totally unique from each other, completely custom made. It's not like racing will become later, where it's pretty standard vehicles that are that vary internally. There was no standardization on the vehicles in the early years. And then we have steam-powered cars. The steam-powered cars actually had a pretty great advantage in the early years of racing, and that is because the 1-mile record was started from a rolling start, and once it would hit the, they would have a slow rolling start, and once they would hit the actual marker to start the race, the steamer could go full throttle right away, while the gasoline-powered cars with internal combustion engines had to work through their gears. And so in these kinds of races, the gasoline-powered cars were actually at a great disadvantage. And so the race that's depicted here is from 1905. We're kind of, I'm running a little over on time, so I won't play my video, but this race actually, you can find a video on YouTube of it, and I will post it in the chat before we leave today. But the steam-powered car was a homemade American car, and these 3 were factory-made Mercedes European cars. And nobody would have expected that this homemade car would beat them, but because of that advantage of the steam-powered cars, they did. And then finally, other vehicles that you would see on the beach, wind-powered cars and motorcycles were also present in these races. So the races constituted all different kinds of vehicles featuring various propulsion methods mentioned previously, racing against each other based on weight class. The same vehicles would compete in multiple races of varying lengths. 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 5 miles, 10 miles. As the tournaments continued, longer races were added in later years. That is what this picture right here depicts. So they would extend further down the beach and they would circle back because the beach stretch is, I want to say it's about 17 miles of raceable stretch. So once long races became the order of the day, they attempted to add that to the beach tournaments. The races were held not only head to head, but as I mentioned earlier, they really had a focus on beating records of being the fastest in the world, the fastest in America, the fastest in the world. And that is emblematic of that progressive era attitude. Despite only having 2 actual racing cars in the first tournament actually set 7 automobile American records and 2 motorcycle world records. So making the first ORMOND-DAYTONA Beach tournament a great success, and it got a lot of attention because how could this many records come out of this ragtag, barely attended tournament? Sometimes the owner of the vehicle would be the driver, but more often the wealthy vehicle owners would enlist their chauffeurs as drivers. So race car drivers collectively originally were called chauffeurs. And some of the most famous race car drivers of the era actually began their careers as chauffeurs to rich men. With the success of the first tournament, interest was generated not only in America, but also amongst racing enthusiasts throughout the world. By the conclusion of the second beach tournament, 4 American records had been set, and 12 world records had been set on ORMOND-DAYTONA Beach. So some of the most famous automobile pioneers participated in the races on these in the races on this beach. Including Ransom Olds, I mentioned earlier. Here we have Louis Chevrolet depicted. This is not Henry Ford. This is a hired driver for Henry Ford, but this is Henry Ford's racer. Henry Ford was there. J. Walter Christie participated, and he is actually a pioneer in front-wheel drive. The beach tournaments continued for 8 consecutive years until 1910, with the height of its success in 1906 and 1907. And some of the most prominent automobile manufacturers and famous race car drivers throughout the world would participate, making ORMOND-DAYTONA tournaments some of the most important of the era. If you're interested in learning more, we don't have enough time to go through all of it, but Dick Punnett wrote a really great book that details all of the races and all of the records and everything of this era, the people who were involved. So it's called Beach Racers, Daytona Before NASCAR. I recommend if you're interested in learning more about the specifics of these races. So the early beach tournaments began to decline, and the passion for them began to decline in 1908, 1909, 1910 was the last tournament. And there's a couple of various reasons for that. So one is that focus shifted to long distance racing. So as automobile technology advanced, people began to see, in sort of the spirit of the progressive era, that they saw positive impact on the human condition through technology. They began to change their view on automobiles and thought that automobiles actually could serve a really beneficial practical purpose. And so going fast over a short distance doesn't really highlight a practical influence, a practical advantage of technology, as much as like we could actually use these cars for something. And so cars that could travel far and could travel fast for a far distance were actually seen as being more of a mark of success of the vehicle. So interest shifted to long distance racing. And so Indianapolis Motor Speedway actually opened in August of 1909. And it was an oval track. It was, I want to say, and I may be wrong, if anyone in the can let me know in the comments if I'm incorrect. I think it was the first automobile oval track in the country that wasn't originally a horse track, but someone let me know if I'm wrong about that. But the first Indianapolis 500 was held in 1911. The beach was not ideal for long distance because they take a long time, and the tide would come in. Those races take a long time, and the tide would come in, which would, water would cover the course. Very narrow, comparatively, uh, width in which to race. And so to race up and down the beach, it would be a very narrow turn at the end. Um, and focus shifted also to emerging flight technology. A lot of the people that had been most enthusiastic about the automobile actually shifted their focus in the 1910s to flight and airplanes. So just sort of a general change of interest in some ways. And then one thing that may have impacted the decline in interest was the emergence, impending, I should say, World War I. We know that some of the people who were active in the racing scene in Florida actually, rather than manufacturing automobiles, shifted once the war broke out to wartime manufacturing. So that could have impacted things. And then certainly changing the nature of racing was Henry Ford coming out with the Model T. And so basically what happens here is it reduces the cost of an automobile for around 85%. So it becomes much more mass produced rather than the custom, unique custom cars for every racer. And it's going to shift sort of the nature of racing in the coming decades because of that. So my colleague Allie will take over talking about the 1930s. That was sort of the next big era of racing when we had a resurgence in racing in Florida. But first, I just want to talk about what was going on in the 1920s. Racing was still occurring in the 1920s in Florida, but it was not as prominent as it had been previously or would become again. Here in this photo, we see C. Cogdall, who was a pretty famous in the racing world, and he either lived or stayed in the area, and he tried to promote Daytona Beach in the 1920s as a racing destination with limited success. But what is impactful that happens in the 1920s is not necessarily what is occurring in Florida, it's what is occurring in other parts of the South, and especially up in Appalachia. And that is Prohibition. So Prohibition, of course, had been going on prior to the federal law with the prohibition of the 18th Amendment in 1919. There were dry states and dry counties throughout the country. So there were people moonshining prior to that, prior to the federal law. And what is going to end up happening in the 1920s is the democratization of the automobile that was brought about by Henry Ford with the Model T, combined with the federal law against the federal prohibition law against selling and transporting alcohol, is that it's going to create a situation where racing can change. And that happens because moonshiners essentially they had an interest in having fast cars, and these were just kind of everyday folks. And so they had the mass-produced cars like Henry Ford's Model T. And so what they would do is they would actually hire really good mechanics to soup up their cars. And the reason they would do that is because they would be running alcohol to various places, and they would need to outrun either local or federal agents. One of the failings of Prohibition was that there wasn't a lot of infrastructure to enforce Prohibition. And so if you were a moonshiner, if you had a car that could just drive faster than the agents who were chasing you, you stood a pretty good chance of getting away with it. You stood a pretty good chance of becoming a successful moonshiner. So those who are familiar with NASCAR's history may already know that NASCAR sort of views their origins in stock car racing with the prohibitionists, at least a lot of the early pioneers in NASCAR do. And in fact, Junior Johnson, who was one of NASCAR's earliest racing stars, asserted his belief that, quote, if it hadn't been for whiskey, NASCAR wouldn't have been formed. That's a fact, end quote. Johnson's family were longtime moonshiners, and he credited his experience as a moonshine runner with the start of his racing career. So not only would they need the souped up cars, but in the early 1930s, when Ford rolled out his V8 engine, it put the federal agents at more of an equal playing field with the souped up cars that the moonshiners had. And so the driver's ability became of as great importance as the speed of the car itself. So the driver's ability to actually race fast and to maneuver well, I should say, became just as important. And so in the era of the 1930s and 40s that Allie's going to talk about, that combination of driving skill and a fast car, which is actually, of course, still a hallmark of the racing world today, what actually came about because of what was happening with the moonshiners during the Prohibition era. So with that, I will let Allie take over with the end of our presentation.
Thanks. We can just switch the slide. Perfect. All right, so like Katie had just said, Prohibition did end in 1933, but just because it ended didn't mean that the runners or the moonshiners stopped. There were still a lot of dry towns, and there was a very heavy tax on alcohol. So moonshiners and runners were still operating because they realized that they could save a lot of money. And outside of Prohibition, stock racing had already become very popular because seeing people make their cars go faster and do all these different things became a very normal hobby for a lot of people. So the stock car racing started in 1936, and in 1935 is when the speed races stopped. So the very last speed race was in 1935, and then stock car racing started in 1936. Speed trials were great for showing how fast your car could go, but a stock car race was able to show how fast your car could go, but also how good of a driver you were. So how you can maneuver, especially for the runners and stuff, because when they were in the mountains, they had to be able to take tight curves. They had to be able to get away very quickly. So the skill of driving became much more important, and the runners and the moonshiners found this as a really great way to showcase their skills, to see who was the best of the best. At the end of the speed trials, they ended in Daytona in 1935, and that's actually the year that Sir Malcolm Campbell broke the 300-mile-per-hour barrier in Utah. And it was in his Bluebird, which was what his vehicle was named. In Daytona, he set a speed record for 276 miles per hour in 1933. So he broke them back to back. Because of how the races were changing from speed to stock car, the track now, Katie, if you could change the slide. Thanks. The track now turned into the giant oval that you might be familiar with, where it is half beach and then half road. So the track would be on A1A and then the Atlantic shoreline. And then you'd have a little dune curve with the sand. It was very unsuccessful for a couple years. The promotions were not doing good. And the first two races that they had lost money. In 1939, Bill France took over the promoting and the promotions, and it actually started making money. But unfortunately, 1941 was when Pearl Harbor happened. So all the racing was halted. Racing came back in 1945. The course, of course, was, of course, renovated because it hadn't been used a lot and the sand and everything. So they renovated it, and they were able to bring this new wave of excitement. Because it was so much busier, they made a longer course. So instead of being 3.5 miles as the original, now it is 4.1 miles long. So they just stretched it out a little more, but it was still half beach, half road. And this is about, and that was in a 1948 that this happened. Um, at the end of 1947, Bill France Sr. actually decided to start meeting with other promoters and racers to discuss building a sanctioning body for the races. A lot of the times, racers could find themselves scammed out of money or just being left there because the event wasn't held in the way that it was promoted. So Bill France, as a racer himself, wanted to make sure that wasn't happening anymore. So Bill France and others had this discussion, and this was the discussion that led to the formation of NASCAR. They discussed having 3 divisions: a modified division, a roadster division, and a strictly stock division. Katie, can you do the next slide? So modified division is the only open wheel division in NASCAR. This is the division that adds aftermarket additions and stronger substitutions. So you'll see a lot of wider tires, bigger block engines, and other kind of technology to make the car faster. Strictly stock is the form of racing that originally used production models. So the cars and the parts had to be entirely made up of things that were available to the public. So that means that anyone could walk in, buy it, and put it on their car. And then the last one was Roadster, and that was for old top cars, hot rods, and it didn't really have a lot of interest with these NASCAR fans, so that was actually dropped. In 1948, the first Florida NASCAR event was held on the Beach Road course. So the International Speedway is not built yet, but they were having NASCAR races on the Beach Road course that we talked about. And it was one of the modified division races, which was normal for the time. Bill France Sr., who wanted to have a race for strictly stock cars, started that in 1949. And this is what we know as the NASCAR Cup Series now. So July 10th, 1949, you had your first strictly stock car, and it continued for about 10 years. The NASCAR races continued for about 10 years, and then the last stock car race was held on the beach in 1958. That was the year that construction began for the Daytona International Speedway. The Speedway opened on February 2nd, 1959, and for its first race, it was very exciting because it was actually a photo finish, and it took them 3 days to come to a decision on who had won. So the first race of the Daytona Speedway did not let you down. And that is where NASCAR starts.
Awesome. Okay, so we do have just a couple minutes left. I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see the chat to see if we got any questions. It does not look like we have any yet, which is totally fine. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, we are at the end of our hour, so I will briefly talk about What is the most surprising? Okay, so we do have a question. What is the most surprising and shocking thing that you learned during your research on racing in Florida? Um, I was, um, I guess I was most surprised to know that, we talk about racing in Florida a lot on Ormond-Daytona Beach, but I was surprised to know that really all of the heavy hitters in the automobile industry were were present on the beach in those early years because I did the research on the early years. That's the one I can speak to. So the fact that Henry Ford, Ransom Olds, all of these people, the Vanderbilts, they were all present on the beach and they were all involved in the racing scene. I guess that would be for me one of the most interesting things that I found was that like really Florida really was in the winter months at the center of the racing scene in the world, really. Anything to add, Allie?
I think the most surprising one would be the Prohibition story. So not just like that it came from Prohibition, but the people that were doing Prohibition, these big names that you get from like the starting racing history, were actually just very heavy runners. They would be doing the running and then also doing races on the side. So one day they could be there and then the next day they could be getting arrested for something. And I think that's really cool that we are able to see people that not only were a pioneer in something and have like their name and history for like a good thing and a positive thing, but also they were on the wrong side of the law sometimes.
Yeah, it is actually kind of a uh, romanticized version of history when we think of like these ragtag prohibitioners, these moonshiners that became racing sensations, and they really did. So that's actually really fascinating. Thank you for the question. All right, we do have just a minute left, so I'm going to share my screen again so we can talk about some of the other really great upcoming stuff we have happening at the History Center that we would love you all to check out. So for February 13th and 17th, we are doing screenings of A Long Time Coming, a 1955 baseball story. This tells the story of the first integrated Little League game, and it was actually played here in Orlando. So you are welcome to attend those. We have a virtual program called Legends and Lore, exploring mythical worlds in video gaming. This is associated with our current temporary run exhibition, Giants, Dragons, and Unicorns, the World of Mythic Creatures. So that is taking place virtually Saturday, February 26th at 1 p.m. The Mythic Creatures exhibition I mentioned will be running through May 8th, so if you haven't had a chance yet, you can come check that out. And then finally, our third annual Women's History Month celebration will be taking place on Thursday, March 10th at 8 to 10 a.m. It is a breakfast event. And this year we will be honoring Marianne Carroll, who was one of the, and really the only original female highwaymen. So if you're familiar with the highwayman artist, Marianne Carroll was one of the original highwayman artists, and she was the only female highwayman artist. So we will be honoring her at that event. So we would love to see you there. You can learn more about everything we're doing here at the History Center at thehistorycenter.org. And if you're specifically interested in our events, historycenter.org/events is where you can find more information about that. We do our lunch and learns on the first Friday of every month. So March's lunch and learn will be about the women who have shaped Central Florida's history. So we also hope you can join us for that one. Registration for all of these events is available at this link right down here. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you for attending our presentation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you found it informative, and we definitely hope to see you at the History Center again sometime soon.